Hey guys, tonight we descend into the gilded nightmare of Versailles and the blood-soaked streets of revolutionary Paris. The tragic collision between divine right monarchy and popular rage that gave us the guillotine, awkward diplomatic marriages, and the subtle art of losing your head while maintaining royal composure. So before you get comfortable in your decidedly attached to your shoulders state, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching historical figures navigate their way towards spectacularly inevitable doom. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and whether your country has ever executed its monarchy. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from nations that kept their kings versus those that decided decapitation was more their style. Now, dim the lights. Maybe light a candle for that authentic 18th century ambience, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through powder, politics, and public executions. So, you think you could have survived being Marie Antoinette? Charming, truly. Like believing you could have talked your way out of the French Revolution with a compelling PowerPoint presentation about the benefits of absolute monarchy. Tonight, we're walking in the silk slippers of Austria's most expensive diplomatic gift to France. A young woman who went from fairy tale princess to the most hated person in the country, all while learning that sometimes your greatest enemy isn't a foreign army or a political rival, but the very people you were born to rule. We'll experience firsthand what it was like to be Marie Antoinette, from the suffocating ceremonies of Versailles to the cold stones of the conciergerie prison, right up to that final, fatal meeting with Henry Sanson and his gleaming blade. Because nothing says, "Till death do us part," quite like a revolutionary execution. And tonight, we're attending the most consequential wedding ceremony in French history. Before you could even dream of wearing a crown, you had to survive being born into the wrong family at precisely the wrong moment in history. Congratulations, you're now Marie Antoinette, Austria's most expensive diplomatic gift to France. And your life's trajectory has just been decided by a bunch of powdered men in rooms you'll never see, discussing your uterus like it's a particularly promising vineyard. Step 1. Exist as a bargaining chip. Chest out, smile practiced, expectations astronomical. Your mother, Empress Maria Theresa, has seen 1,000 daughters and knows exactly what you're worth in terms of international relations. She checks your posture, not to compliment your grace, but to make sure you can stand upright during 6-hour ceremonies without fainting and embarrassing the Habsburg name. Slutching rejected. Visible intelligence heavily discouraged. Any sign that you might have opinions about your own life, absolutely forbidden. Beauty mattered. Fertility mattered. Having a face that didn't scream, "I read books when no one's looking," that was pure gold. If you made it past inspection, you were now considered marriageable, which in royal terms meant unlikely to immediately start a war or die in childbirth before producing an heir. And yes, you had to swear an oath, not to God or Austria, but to France, a country you'd never seen, whose language you barely spoke, and whose people would eventually want to separate your head from your shoulders. This oath was taken very seriously. If you broke it, you weren't sent to your room. You were exiled, imprisoned, or guillotined, which sounds like a quick medical procedure, but actually means having your neck introduced to a very sharp blade for the entertainment of bloodthirsty crowds. Still excited about that crown? Good. Now pack your entire identity into a diplomatic carriage and prepare for the rest of your life to be a performance, where forgetting your lines means death. They called this an honor. Austrian princesses lined up for it. Some were even excited. Adventure, they said. Queenship, they said. Most of them didn't make it past their first diplomatic crisis, and don't think being an archduchess made it easier. In fact, it made it mandatory. If you were the wrong combination of foreign and female, congratulations. The French court was your stage and your prison. Of course, you could always try to be a good queen. They just expected you to be simultaneously invisible and perfectly visible, silent and charmingly conversational. Austrian enough to seal the alliance, but French enough not to be suspicious. And that's just the engagement process. So you made it to Versailles. You're married to the future king. Hooray! Now the real fun begins. The systematic destruction of everything you thought you knew about being human. Forget privacy. You're no longer Antonia, or that girl who liked to read in the gardens. You are now Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, or more accurately, a walking symbol of everything wrong with monarchy, wrapped in silk and scandal. Your new identity was wrapped in whalebone corsets, layers of petticoats, and the scent of whatever political crisis was rotting in the halls of Versailles this week. Your hair, a towering architectural marvel that required 3 servants and enough powder to flour a small bakery. Your clothes, designed by committee to send messages you didn't even understand. Everyone watched the same, judged the same, whispered the same cruel assessments. You want to express yourself? Adorable. Try commissioning a pastoral cottage and watch the entire nation lose its collective mind about your extravagance. The court didn't do authenticity. It was performance. And your audience was 50 million hungry French citizens who were just as miserable and significantly more dangerous than you. You slept in apartments so public that getting dressed required an audience, stacked with ladies, in waiting like overdressed sardines. If one gossiped, you all suffered. If one made a political misstep, you all reassessed your survival strategies. Oh, and about your role, it wasn't optional. The Queen, symbol of divine right, patron of arts, and scapegoat for every economic disaster, weren't suggestions. But here's where the story gets interesting, where your perfectly planned royal performance starts improvising its way toward tragedy. Because while you were learning to navigate the impossible expectations of Versailles, learning to smile while being systematically blamed for France's financial collapse, learning to pretend that cake jokes were hilarious when people were literally starving, someone else was preparing for a very different kind of performance. His name was Henry Sanson, and if you thought your job had no room for error, his was significantly less forgiving. While you were mastering the art of looking regal while doing absolutely nothing useful, he was mastering the art of killing people efficiently and cleanly for the entertainment and supposed moral edification of crowds who found public executions more thrilling than theatre. The Sanson family had been in the execution business for generations. Not because they were monsters, mind you, but because someone had to do it, and in France, certain jobs ran in families like particularly morbid heirlooms. Henry inherited the position of chief executioner of Paris, the way you inherited your crown, through accidents of birth and the expectations of people who never asked if this was what either of you actually wanted to do with your lives. While you spent your days in drawing rooms, discussing the latest fashions, and trying not to say anything that could be interpreted as political commentary, Henry spent his days maintaining the scaffold, keeping his axe sharp, and probably wondering if there was any other profession where job performance could be measured in how quickly you could separate someone's soul from their body. You never met Henry Sanson during your queenly years, of course. Your social circles were somewhat different. You attended operas, he attended executions. You worried about protocol violations, he worried about whether the condemned would struggle or go quietly. You both served the crown, technically, but from very different angles. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention that while you lived in luxury that most French citizens couldn't even imagine, the man whose job it would eventually be to kill you lived modestly, worked diligently, and probably had a better understanding of the common people's daily struggles than you ever would. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you had to survive being queen during the most inconvenient period in French history to be royal. The 1780s weren't kind to monarchs anywhere, but France was developing a particularly creative approach to expressing dissatisfaction with their leadership. Your daily routine as queen was a masterpiece of meaningless ceremony designed to make you feel important, while ensuring you remained completely powerless. Wake up in a bed that cost more than most villages earned in a year. Be dressed by servants who followed protocols so rigid that putting on a chemise required consultation with an etiquette manual. Attend breakfast, which wasn't really about eating but about being seen eating the right things in the right order, while making conversation that was simultaneously sparkling and completely devoid of substance. Mornings were for audiences, where people who had spent months or years trying to get 5 minutes of your time would present requests that you couldn't grant, problems you couldn't solve, and complaints about policies you hadn't made. You'd nod sympathetically, make non-committal sounds, and refer them to ministers who might actually have power to do something useful. Afternoons were for more ceremony. Walks in gardens where every step was choreographed. Conversations where every word was analysed for hidden meaning. And activities that were supposed to look spontaneous but were planned more carefully than military campaigns. You couldn't sneeze without 3 people discussing whether it indicated a political position. Evenings brought the theatre of court entertainment. Not entertainment for you, mind you, but entertainment that you were required to provide by existing beautifully and regally while other people performed, discussed, debated, and schemed around you. You were simultaneously the most important person in the room and the least relevant to anything actually happening. And through it all, that growing awareness that outside the golden bubble of Versailles, people were angry. Not just annoyed or disappointed, but genuinely, dangerously furious about the kind of life you were living while they struggled to afford bread. The kind of anger that makes people do things they never thought they'd do, like storm palaces and demand the heads of queens. You tried to be a good queen, whatever that meant. You patronized the arts, supported charitable causes, and attempted to learn enough about politics to have intelligent conversations with the ministers who actually ran the country. But everything you did was filtered through the lens of public suspicion. Donate to charity, and you were accused of trying to buy popularity. Show interest in politics, and you were accused of foreign manipulation. Try to live quietly, and you were accused of indifference to the people's suffering. The Austrian connection didn't help. Every diplomatic crisis between France and Austria was somehow your fault. Every military setback was blamed on your supposed divided loyalties. Every economic problem was attributed to your extravagant spending, even when the numbers clearly showed that royal household expenses were a tiny fraction of France's financial troubles. But public anger isn't interested in nuance or accuracy. Public anger wants someone to blame, someone visible and symbolic to focus all that frustration and fear and genuine suffering on. And you, with your foreign accent and your expensive dresses and your complete inability to do anything actually useful about France's problems, were the perfect target. Meanwhile, Henry Sanson was going about his business with the kind of professional competence that his job required. Executions in 18th century France were public spectacles, carefully orchestrated events designed to demonstrate the power of royal justice and hopefully deter other people from committing similar crimes. Henry's job wasn't just to kill people efficiently, it was to kill them in a way that satisfied the crowd's need for drama while maintaining the dignity of the state's authority. This required a very specific skill set, technical competence with various instruments of death, obviously, but also crowd management, timing, psychological assessment of the condemned, and the ability to remain calm and professional while surrounded by thousands of people who were there specifically to watch you kill someone. Henry had been doing this for years by the time your reign started going seriously wrong. He'd executed thieves, murderers, political prisoners, and various other categories of people that the state had decided needed to die for the good of society. Each execution followed protocols as rigid as court ceremony, with specific procedures for everything from how the condemned should be transported to the scaffold to exactly what words should be spoken before the axe fell. He was good at his job, which in this context meant that people died quickly and cleanly, without unnecessary suffering or dramatic struggles that might turn the crowd against the proceedings. He understood that his role was to be an instrument of justice, not a performer in a revenge fantasy. The distinction mattered, both legally and personally. But as the political situation in France deteriorated, as the revolution gathered momentum and the definition of justice began to change, Henry found himself in an increasingly complicated position. The same technical skills that had made him an effective executioner of common criminals were now being applied to a very different category of condemned, political prisoners, aristocrats, and eventually royalty. You probably weren't thinking much about Henry Sanson during the early days of the revolution. You had more immediate concerns, like the fact that your husband's authority was collapsing, your palace was being surrounded by increasingly hostile crowds, and your very existence as queen was becoming a liability to everyone around you. The transformation from queen to prisoner happened gradually, then all at once. First, the restrictions on your movement, framed as security measures for your own protection. Then the reduction in your household, explained as economic necessity. Then the relocation from Versailles to Paris, presented as an opportunity to be closer to the people you served. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation, a sensible response to changing circumstances. Only in retrospect did the pattern become clear. You were being systematically stripped of everything that had made you queen, one ceremony and privilege at a time, until all that remained was a woman in expensive clothes waiting to find out what would happen next. The Tuileries Palace wasn't Versailles. The accommodations were adequate, the security was obvious, and the atmosphere was tense in a way that no amount of royal protocol could disguise. You were still officially queen, still treated with the forms of respect, but everyone involved understood that you were essentially under house arrest, while the country decided what to do with monarchy as an institution. Your daily routine shifted from meaningless ceremony to anxious waiting. News from outside was filtered through advisors who were trying to balance honesty with not causing panic. Letters were intercepted and analyzed. Visitors were screened and monitored. You were living in a bubble, but now it was a bubble designed to contain rather than protect. And outside that bubble, the revolution was developing its own momentum, its own logic, its own sense of what justice required. The same people who had once cheered your arrival in France as a young bride were now calling for your trial as a traitor. The same political system that had elevated you to queen was now treating queenship itself as a crime against the people. Henry Sanson was watching these developments with professional interest. Political executions were different from criminal executions in terms of public attention and symbolic importance, but the technical requirements were the same. Someone condemned to death needed to be killed efficiently and publicly, regardless of their former rank or the nature of their alleged crimes. The introduction of the guillotine changed Henry's job significantly. Dr. Guillotine had designed his machine with the best of intentions, creating a method of execution that was quick, painless, and egalitarian. No more axe work that required skill and strength, no more variation in suffering based on the executioner's competence or the condemned's social status, just a blade, a mechanism, and gravity. For Henry, the guillotine meant that his role shifted from skilled craftsman to technician. Instead of needing years of training to wield an axe effectively, he now needed to understand mechanics, maintain equipment, and operate what was essentially a very specialized piece of machinery. The job became more reliable but somehow less personal. You weren't thinking about guillotines during your early imprisonment. You were thinking about escape plans, about political solutions, about the possibility that this was all a temporary madness that would resolve itself once people came to their senses. You were still thinking like a queen, assuming that reasonable people would eventually recognize the importance of preserving monarchy, even if reforms were necessary. This was a fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening. The revolution wasn't interested in reforming monarchy, it was interested in replacing it entirely. You weren't a queen who needed to be reformed, you were a symbol that needed to be destroyed. The distinction mattered, because it meant that no amount of cooperation or compromise on your part was going to change the ultimate outcome. Your husband understood this sooner than you did. King Louis XVI had never wanted to be king in the first place, had never felt comfortable with the responsibilities and expectations that came with absolute power, and was probably relieved when that power was systematically taken away from him. He approached his imprisonment and eventual trial with a kind of resigned acceptance that you found both admirable and incomprehensible. You, on the other hand, had been trained from childhood to be queen, not just to wear the crown and perform the ceremonies, but to believe in the fundamental importance of monarchy as an institution. Giving up wasn't just personal defeat, it was betrayal of everything you'd been taught to value. So you kept fighting, kept scheming, kept believing that somehow this situation could be reversed. The trial, when it finally came, was theatre as much as legal proceeding. Everyone involved knew what the outcome would be. The question was how to present it in a way that satisfied the political requirements of the moment. You were accused of treason, of conspiring with foreign enemies, of corrupting your husband and undermining the revolution. Some of the charges were based on actual letters and actions. Others were extrapolated from assumptions about what someone in your position must have been thinking. Your defense was constrained by the fact that admitting to some of the charges might have saved your life, but would have validated the revolution's entire critique of monarchy. Denying everything made you look dishonest, but preserved the principle that queens shouldn't have to justify their actions to their subjects. You chose principle over pragmatism, which was probably inevitable given your upbringing, but definitely guaranteed the outcome. Henry Sanson was preparing for your execution while your lawyers were still presenting arguments that everyone knew wouldn't matter. The guillotine needed to be inspected, the scaffold needed to be constructed, and the timing needed to be coordinated with security forces who were expecting massive crowds. Technical details that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence, but everything to do with the practical requirements of public execution. He'd executed your husband a few months earlier, which had been its own kind of complex event. Kings didn't die easily in the public imagination. It required careful staging to transform Louis XVI from divinely appointed monarch to condemned traitor in the space of a scaffold speech. Henry had handled it professionally, but the psychological weight of executing royalty was different from executing common criminals. Now he was preparing to execute a queen, which carried even more symbolic importance. You weren't just Marie Antoinette, you were the embodiment of everything the revolution was trying to destroy. Your death wasn't just punishment for alleged crimes, it was the final rejection of the entire system that had made you queen. You probably weren't thinking about Henry's psychological preparation during your final weeks of imprisonment. You were thinking about your children, about letters you wanted to write, about whether there was any possibility of last-minute reprieve or rescue. You were thinking about how to die with dignity, how to maintain some version of royal bearing even while being killed by your own subjects. The conciergerie prison was a significant step down from the Tuileries Palace. Small cell, straw mattress, constant supervision by guards who made no pretense of respect or deference. You were still Marie Antoinette, but now you were Marie Antoinette in chains, Marie Antoinette under indictment, Marie Antoinette waiting to die. Your hair had gone white, whether from stress or poor nutrition, or just the natural process of aging under extreme circumstances. Your clothes were simple, practical garments that bore no resemblance to the elaborate court dress that had once defined your public image. You looked like what you had become, a middle-aged woman in prison, waiting to find out when and how she would be killed. The irony was that imprisonment had probably given you a clearer understanding of ordinary people's lives than you'd ever had as queen. Limited food, uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, restricted movement, constant uncertainty about the future. This was how most of your subjects had always lived, and now you were experiencing it firsthand. But this realization came too late to matter for your political situation. The revolution wasn't interested in your personal growth or increased empathy. It was interested in your death as a symbol of the complete rejection of the old order. You could have become the most enlightened, compassionate person in France during your imprisonment, and it wouldn't have changed the fact that you needed to die for the revolution to feel complete. Henry Sanson understood this better than you did, probably. His job had always been about symbolism as much as punishment. Public executions were political theatre, designed to reinforce social boundaries and demonstrate the consequences of challenging authority. Your execution was going to be the culmination of years of revolutionary theatre, the moment when the old world was finally and definitively replaced by the new. He was also dealing with the practical challenges of executing someone who had once been the most powerful woman in France. Security was a major concern. There were rumours of rescue attempts, of loyalist plots of foreign intervention. The execution needed to happen quickly and publicly, but also safely for everyone involved except you. The crowd was going to be massive and potentially uncontrollable. People who had been calling for your death for years were finally going to get to witness it. The emotional intensity was going to be unlike anything Henry had experienced, even during your husband's execution. Queens carried different symbolic weight than kings. Your death was going to feel like a more personal victory for people who had been powerless their entire lives. Your final days were spent in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for news that never came, hoping for developments that never materialized. Your lawyers had exhausted every legal avenue. Your supporters had exhausted every political option. Your family had exhausted every diplomatic possibility. All that remained was the countdown to October 16, 1793, and your appointment with Henry Sanson's guillotine. You wrote letters, including one to Madame Elizabeth that became famous for its forgiveness of your executioners and its expression of hope that your death might somehow contribute to France's future happiness. Whether you actually believed this, or were simply trying to find meaning in a meaningless situation, the sentiment was remarkable given the circumstances. Henry Sanson was also preparing, in his own way, for what would probably be the most significant execution of his career. Not because the technical requirements were any different, but because the historical and political importance was unprecedented. He was going to kill the last Queen of France, and everyone involved understood that this moment would be remembered and analysed for generations. The morning of October 16 began like any other execution day, with the same preparations and procedures that Henry had followed hundreds of times before. But the atmosphere was different, charged with an anticipation and excitement that went beyond the usual crowd dynamics of public execution. You were awakened early, given time to dress and write final letters, and informed that the time had come. No ceremony, no elaborate preparations. Just the simple reality that you were going to die in a few hours and needed to prepare yourself mentally and spiritually for that event. The transport from prison to scaffold was designed to be as public and humiliating as possible. Not a closed carriage that might preserve some dignity, but an open cart that allowed the crowds lining the streets to see you clearly, to confirm that the proud queen had been reduced to a condemned prisoner on her way to execution. Henry Sanson was waiting at the scaffold, having spent the morning checking and rechecking equipment that he knew was working perfectly. The guillotine was a reliable machine, but this particular execution couldn't afford any technical problems. Everything needed to work smoothly, quickly, and visibly for the crowd that had been gathering since dawn. You climbed the scaffold steps with whatever dignity you could manage under the circumstances. Your hands were bound, your hair had been cut short to expose your neck, and you were wearing the simple white dress that had become your uniform during imprisonment. Not the elaborate court dress of your queenly years, but something that would serve adequately for dying. Henry Sanson was professional and efficient, as he had been trained to be. No dramatic speeches, no unnecessary delays, no opportunities for last-minute complications. Just the business of positioning you correctly, securing the restraints, and operating the machine that would end your life in a matter of seconds. Your last words were reportedly an apology to Henry for accidentally stepping on his foot during the final positioning. Whether this actually happened, or was invented later, by people who wanted to emphasize your grace under pressure, it became part of the story, the kind of detail that makes historical figures seem human rather than merely symbolic. The blade fell, the crowd cheered, and Marie Antoinette ceased to exist, not just as a person, but as an institution. The last Queen of France had been executed by the people of France, using a machine designed by a French doctor and operated by a French executioner. The revolution was complete, at least symbolically. Henry Sanson held up your severed head for the crowd to see, as was traditional, then probably wondered if he felt any different about having just killed a queen instead of a common criminal. The technical aspects had been identical, but the historical weight was unprecedented. He had just participated in ending 1,000 years of French monarchy. For you, of course, it was simply the end. No more politics, no more ceremony, no more impossible expectations or unsolvable problems. Just the final moment of a life that had been shaped from birth by forces beyond your control, ending in a death that had been inevitable once those same forces turned against you. The crowd began to disperse, satisfied that justice had been done, though different people in that crowd probably had very different ideas about what justice meant in this context. Some saw the execution of a traitor who had betrayed France. Others saw the necessary sacrifice required to build a new kind of society. Still others probably just saw entertainment, the spectacle of watching someone who had once been untouchably powerful reduced to a corpse on a scaffold. Henry Sanson began the process of cleaning up, dismantling the scaffold, and preparing for whatever executions would follow. Because the revolution wasn't finished. It was just entering a new phase where former allies would become enemies, where the definition of treason would continue to evolve, where the guillotine would become a permanent fixture of French political life. Your body was buried in an unmarked grave, without ceremony or recognition, not because anyone particularly hated you personally by that point, but because acknowledging your death with royal honours would have contradicted the entire purpose of executing you in the first place. You had to disappear completely, both physically and symbolically, for the revolution to feel successful. Henry Sanson continued working as chief executioner through the Terror, the period when the revolution consumed its own children with the same enthusiasm it had shown for consuming its enemies. He executed Robespierre, Danton, and hundreds of other people who had once supported your execution, but had fallen victim to the revolution's increasingly paranoid logic. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention that the same machine and the same executioner who had killed the Queen of France were now killing the revolutionaries who had demanded her death. The guillotine was egalitarian in the most literal sense. It killed aristocrats and commoners, royalists and republicans, with equal efficiency and indifference. Your death had been intended to symbolize the triumph of the people over aristocratic oppression, but it quickly became clear that the people were just as capable of oppression as any aristocrat had ever been. The revolution that had killed you in the name of liberty and equality proceeded to kill thousands of other people in the name of the same principles. Henry Sanson probably understood this better than most people, since his job required him to execute people regardless of their political beliefs or social background. The guillotine didn't distinguish between guilty and innocent, between deserving and undeserving. It just killed efficiently, which was what it had been designed to do. Your story became legend almost immediately, but not the kind of legend you might have wanted. Not the story of a queen who had gracefully adapted to changing times or who had successfully reformed monarchy for the modern world. Instead, the story of a queen who had become so disconnected from her people's reality that she had to be killed to make room for a better future. Whether this story was fair or accurate became less important than whether it was useful for the people telling it. Revolutionaries used your story to justify the necessity of radical change. Monarchists used it to demonstrate the dangers of popular democracy. Foreign observers used it to warn about the consequences of political instability. Henry Sanson's story, meanwhile, became a footnote to your story. He was remembered primarily as the man who had executed Marie Antoinette, rather than as a professional who had spent decades managing the technical and psychological challenges of public execution. His role in history was defined by that single moment when the blade fell and ended your life. The relationship between queen and executioner, such as it was, had lasted only a few minutes on a scaffold in Paris, but it represented something larger about the relationship between power and powerlessness, between the people who make decisions and the people who implement them, between the world that had created you as queen and the world that had destroyed you as a symbol. You had never chosen to be queen, any more than Henry had chosen to be an executioner. Both roles had been inherited, shaped by family expectations and social needs that had nothing to do with personal preference or individual capability. Both roles required you to suppress personal feelings in service of larger institutional purposes. The difference was that Henry's institution survived the revolution, while yours was completely destroyed. There was still a need for executioners in revolutionary France, but there was no longer any need for queens. Your role had become obsolete, his had simply changed employers. In the end, the story of the queen who married her executioner isn't really about marriage in any conventional sense. It's about the moment when one world ended and another began, when the relationship between rulers and ruled was redefined in the most dramatic way possible. You didn't marry Henry Sanson. You were briefly and fatally united with him in a single act that symbolized the complete transformation of French society. Your wedding dress was the simple white gown you wore to the scaffold, Your wedding ceremony was the few minutes of preparation before the blade fell. Your wedding vows were whatever final words you spoke before Henry positioned you under the guillotine. And your honeymoon was the eternity that followed, where Queen and executioner were equally irrelevant to the new world that had been built on the ruins of the old. The crowds that had gathered to witness your execution probably didn't think of it in terms of marriage, but there was something ceremonial about the event, something that resembled a wedding in its public nature and symbolic importance. Two people who had never met were brought together for a single moment that would define both of their legacies, witnessed by thousands of people who understood that they were seeing history being made. Henry Sanson went home that evening having completed the most significant task of his professional life. You went nowhere, having completed the most significant task of dying with whatever dignity the circumstances allowed. The revolution continued, the guillotine continued to function, and France continued its experiment with popular government. But something had ended forever on that scaffold, something that had defined European civilization for centuries. The idea that some people were born to rule others, that political authority came from God rather than from popular consent, that queens were somehow different from ordinary women in ways that mattered for governance. Your execution didn't just kill Marie Antoinette, it killed the entire concept of queenship as a legitimate form of political authority. Henry Sanson had been the instrument of that killing, but he hadn't been its architect. He had simply been the person with the technical skills necessary to translate political theory into physical reality. The machine that killed you continued to function for years afterward, killing people whose crimes were less symbolic but equally fatal under the logic of revolutionary justice. Henry continued to operate it, continued to perform his professional duties, continued to serve whatever government happened to be in power at any given moment. Your story ended on October 16, 1793. But the story of what your death meant continued to evolve. Different generations found different lessons in your fate, different warnings about the dangers of political extremism or the necessity of social change. You became a symbol that meant whatever people needed it to mean, rather than a person who had lived and died under specific historical circumstances. Henry Sanson's story continued for several more decades through the Directory, the Consulate, the Empire, and the Restoration. He executed people under every government that followed the Revolution, demonstrating that regardless of political ideology, all governments eventually find reasons to kill some of their citizens publicly. The guillotine itself outlasted both of you, remaining France's preferred method of execution well into the 20th century. Ductra. Guillotine's machine proved more durable than any of the political systems it served, more reliable than any of the ideologies it was used to defend. But the moment when you and Henry Sanson were briefly united on that scaffold in 1793 remained unique in its historical significance. It was the moment when the old world publicly acknowledged its own death, when monarchy formally surrendered to democracy, when the divine right of kings was replaced by the sovereign will of the people. Your marriage to your executioner lasted only as long as it took for the blade to fall, but it symbolized a transformation that would reshape European politics for the next 2 centuries. Queens would continue to exist, but they would never again wield the kind of absolute power that had made your execution seem necessary to so many people. Henry Sanson continued his work, but he would never again execute someone whose death carried such profound symbolic weight. The revolution had accomplished its primary symbolic purpose. Everything that followed was just administrative cleanup. The ordinary business of killing people who had committed various crimes against whatever government happened to be in power. You had been Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, wife of Louis XVI, mother of the future Louis XVI, and ultimately victim of historical forces that had been building for decades before your birth. Your executioner had been Henry Sanson, chief executioner of Paris, inheritor of a family profession, servant of the state regardless of what form that state happened to take. Together, for a few minutes on an October morning in 1793, you had participated in ending one era of human history and beginning another. The marriage was brief, the ceremony was brutal, but the consequences were permanent. The world that had made you queen was gone forever, replaced by a world where such queens could no longer exist. And in that sense, perhaps the marriage was successful. It accomplished exactly what it was intended to accomplish, ending your story and beginning a new chapter in the story of human political organization. The bride died. The groom continued his work, and the institution they had served together was transformed beyond recognition. This was your marriage to your executioner, not a romantic union, but a political necessity, not a beginning, but an ending, not a celebration, but a funeral for an entire way of organizing human society. You had married the future, and the future had killed you, as futures always kill the past they replace. The crowds went home satisfied, the executioner cleaned his equipment, and history moved forward into whatever came next. Your part in the story was finished, but the story itself continued, shaped forever by that moment when queen and executioner were briefly, fatally united in the most consequential marriage ceremony in French history.